what we can do about that. So I got interested into the topic of intercultural sustainability approximately 10, 15 years ago. I read a couple of texts, and now I would like just to present you what I have found. So please correct me if I'm wrong. You are very high experts in intercultural communication, I think. And as far as I've seen, Valmiera University is also and has a lot of expertise in sustainable research, in sustainability research. So I think you have a very fruitful forum to develop something new on intercultural sustainability. Yeah, so let us just maybe start right into the topic, into the stuff. As you will probably know, United Nations have developed a charter of 17 sustainability goals in 2015, splitting up goals on sustainable development into different topics, 17 topics, and these again actually are split down into 169 more precise goals. So now if we want also from a political perspective to join that discourse and join that political agenda, we have to fit in somewhere. And maybe probably some of you might know where that could be. So if we take these 17 goals, can you find us somewhere? Where does intercultural communication fit in? Can anybody see that?
Goal number 16, I hear someone say.
16, yeah. That was my favorite too, I must say, but I got disappointed and I was taught something else. Actually, the official discourse puts us into education. Which surprised me too. I would also favor 16, but I read into 16 and actually was nothing to find. It is more into legal structures. But anyway, I went into goal number 4. And if you read into these documents, you can find what the aim of this goal is. So it is actually, to be precise, target 4.7. They say by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and culture's contribution to sustainable development. So to cut it short, cultural diversity is something to be learned at school, they say. So then UNESCO also wants to measure what they have as success factors. So they designed a framework that is supposed to help to measure if and how the development goals are being reached. So they need to define fields or aspects on what to look for. And here's what this is supposed to be. They say on indicator 4.71, extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, including gender equality and human rights, are mainstreamed at levels in national education policies, curricula, teacher education, and student assessment. So more or less rather a general look into schooling, and it's getting more general again. UNESCO even publishes the development results on the internet. For example, the most recent one is in this brochure from 2016. And there they found, or they say that actually even as early as 1974, they made an inquiry into what are guiding principles and related topics in the field of education. And they even then identified goals like cultural diversity and tolerance, international understanding, solidarity, and cooperation. And now they want to see actually what they have reached. The brochure has a lot of statistics into details. I will not really go through that. But what you can see over here, actually every country all over the world is supposed to deliver some numbers, some data to collect and to bring together. And as you can see, the goals are so general that almost everything is reached. But actually, cultural diversity and tolerance, even in this high percentages, is rather poor with 96%. Maybe it is too special or particular compared with the other ones. So what I think is that these goals on intercultural understanding and dialogue are extremely vague. Nobody says how that should look like, what it should contain, or how it should be reached. And in contrast, we have today actually a huge discipline on intercultural communication research with a lot of insights, theories, approaches. We are in 2019. We can no longer say that we are a young discipline or something like that. We have a long tradition. So in some way, we might need to start from scratch over here and check if and how and where intercultural sustainability can be developed in a way that stronger connects to our precious field of research. I think that's what I'm out to do here. So I have published a short definition on what intercultural sustainability might be on the blog website Center for Intercultural Dialogue on intercultural sustainability. I had then defined intercultural sustainability according to the following. So intercultural sustainability as a term comprises any effort to design intercultural relations in ways that ensure a peaceful and a constructive coexistence of people across cultures. This notion builds a bridge between research on intercultural communication and intercultural relations on the one side, and the global political discourse on sustainability on the other side. Today, I would add or specify that when I am talking about intercultural sustainability, this actually relates to the sustainability of intercultural relations. This is one way of many, of course, to see the notion, and I will position this notion among others and alternative or neighboring ones in my presentation later on. So let's just have a short look at my outline. I would like to structure my presentation according to the following. I will first talk about the discourse on interculturality and its hidden norms. So I'm trying a very short appraisal of contemporary research on intercultural communication and interculturality to identify some research needs that may make it useful to talk about things like intercultural sustainability. So whenever I am talking about intercultural sustainability, I actually want to give something back to intercultural communication research. I will then make a cut on intercultural research there, and I will give you a short introduction to the development of political sustainability discourse. I will here already again start calling it a discourse because the discourse level may later on become that level where this political discourse and a discourse on intercultural communication may maybe meet. In the third part, I will explore several models on how to bring together these discourses. So the political one about sustainability and the academic one on intercultural communication. In the fourth part, I will give you an overview on present and on present systematics on how notions of sustainability have been used in research on interculturality so far. And the fifth section is a very short critical reflection on whether it is okay or not from an academic point of view to just simply merge these two discourses just because one thinks it may somehow be useful once upon a time in the future. I think that has to be critically assessed too. And as a last section, I will give you an outlook on what may remain to be done in future research. So let us start with an appraisal of contemporary research on interculturality. I think I need to define a few terms first, so I will be using the term interculturality here in an understanding that recently has been proposed by Dietz 2018. Interculturality is supposed to be taken as a generic term here, embracing earlier, more static understandings of intercultural communication, as well as more recent and dynamic ones. So at the same time, it is supposed to include an awareness for the ethical implications for actions in interculturality. So what should best be done in these situations? More precisely, traditionally, research on intercultural communication and now interculturality has been characterized by a focus on interpersonal communication, and a constructivist approach assumes that cultural affiliations and their assumed effects onto interactions are the results of subjective constructions. These constructions are based on interactants' participation in social discourse. Social discourse is shaped by hidden power imbalances. Contemporary critical research on intercultural communication acknowledges this social constructivist aspects using terms like, for example, anti-essentialism, anti-culturalism, being against neo-essentialism. So one has become very wary towards maybe essentialist notions of cultures and too much culturalizing. This critical field also has a vision on how to proceed in these premises. Some authors plead for an attitude of critical cosmopolitanism, for example. However, in many cases, this is a very open and vague notion. What persons in interculturality then should really do in practice. This is very often rather open. Beyond this, I would like to introduce another premise and assumption. Any research on interculturality will have a normative orientation, although there may be many studies that will claim that they are completely ethically neutral, that they are purely objective analysis and descriptions. They are not. Something like that does not exist. That's what I say, at least. As soon as only a research question is formulated, there will be a politically driven interest behind that which wants to be found out, what is supposed to be found out, which wants to be confirmed or which wants to reject another perspective. So research questions will always be used strategically. Otherwise, nobody would actually undertake the many efforts for the research or even grant money for the funding. One more problem, however, lies in the fact that contemporary research normally does not make these ethical orientations explicit. Instead, ethical orientations are existing, but neither authors nor readers are really aware of them, and even more, of the implications of these ethical orientations. So from a critical perspective, for example, McDonald and O'Regan 2013 focus on this problem. Ethical orientations, they say, are omnipresent, but they are dealt with in a too vague and open way at best. And one problem lies in the fact that some of the ethical orientations may have dangerous or even unwanted effects. Therefore, these authors argue ethics and interculturality should be formulated more precisely, and McDonald and O'Regan here propose an ethics of responsibility. What the authors find in contemporary research is what they call an ethical orientations of presence. Interculturalists want to do everything to understand the world. So, for example, learning foreign languages or learning about different cultures is just one of the symptoms for this orientation. People just want to get along everywhere, and actually the better they do, the better they feel, because then they will perceive our complex and diverse world as a homogeneous whole again. At least they hope so. This longing for presence is actually totalitarian and violent, the authors say, because this attitude wants to absorb and incorporate the whole rest of the world. They will not accept anything beside them. This is why McDonald and O'Regan argue in favor of an ethics of mutual responsibility, for example. It was actually post-colonial research that from the late 1980s onwards has shed some light on the moral obligations that emerge from analyzing aspects of intercultural communication. We are never in a neutral position. Research, observation, and analysis will always happen in contexts of power imbalances, and they will shape these constellations. From a power critical perspective, earlier research on intercultural communication appears as driven by utilitarian ethics frequently. It is out to serve one's own purpose, our own economic growth, or growth of one's own political power, but not intercultural understanding as such. Only from the perspective of post-colonial thought, reflections about social justice enter the discourse on intercultural communication and interculturality. Actually, however, there are even many more different norms and orientations that may potentially underlie research on interculturality. Here I have tried to trace that back by means of a critical reading. So I found that pieces of research on interculturality are basing on different epistemological approaches. They differ in the way they access and perceive reality. These epistemological approaches, they are on the outer circle here, are firstly non-normative. However, when used as a basis for intercultural research, they bring different perceptions of reality into sight. And for example, through the lights of social justice orientations, they bring different challenges, pitfalls, shortcomings, and needs. And on the basis of these needs, an applied research on interculturality will derive different normative orientations or actions. So I had identified, for example, modernism, positivism, critical rationalism on the one side, all on a rather analytically focused approach, and then as interpretive approaches, postmodernism, systems theory, and constructivism, all these interpretive approaches additionally fed by humanism. These epistemological approaches are on the outer circle, and within this circle, I had located single and smaller paradigms, models, and concepts from research on interculturality based on what epistemological basis they are built upon. So you can see on the arrows that these attributions are never completely unidirectional or completely explicit, but you can see tendencies at least. And then as a next step, we can check what normative or ethical orientations derive or continue living in these approaches. So just to take one or two examples, let's take postmodernism as one of the contemporary favored epistemological bases in research on interculturality. Postmodernism implies a strong portion of cultural relativism in its paradigm. Interculturalists and researchers are thus requested to stay aware of ethnocentrisms and to respect diversity. Postmodernism does not allow interculturalists for too much action. It rather promotes a large portion of passiveness. Interventions are always arousing suspicion and wariness. So in contrast to that, positivism, for example, positivism assumes that researchers can see culture without the epistemological step of interpretation. So thus culture can be easily integrated into any other social theory, and models on interculturality can in the same way integrate any other social field, like for example economics or politics. So intercultural interaction is easy from the side of theory here, but there can be strong cultural differences from the perspective of that approach. So as a result, in the end, we can ask, so what approach is the right one? So we have seen that these approaches produce quite oppositional recommendations on what to do in interculturality. They produce different ethics for interculturality, just right from the start, from the underlying theories already, nothing else yet. Later on, what makes it even worse and worse and more difficult is the fact that there are disciplines that consider normativity and confessing oneself to ethical orientations as completely unscientific. So this is the case for, let me generalize it, the whole field of traditional sociology, for example. They really detest ethics. As for example, they oppose to what Caillé and Van den Berge subsumed under the notion of the studies, which are, for example, cultural studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, governmentality studies, and so on. All these disciplines specialize in the systematic investigation of connections between power and discourse. They all have the same technique to discover power structures. They are looking for gaps, for absences in the text. These are the indicators for hidden power imbalances. And all these disciplines claim to be transdisciplinary, transnational. These are must-have attributes. But the problem is that they are boring from a research perspective. The results are always negative and critical, and they are confined to revealing power relations and nothing else. They even ignore at all earlier theory building. So they break up with academic traditions, and they always have the same solutions from a critical perspective. Some authors see research on interculturality thus even in a very miserable state. So for example, Mark Terkesidis in his 2010 German language book Interkultur, which might be interculture or something like that, complains that societies do neither really know how to deal with culture, nor do they lead a constructive discussion steering towards some answers to that question. As a consequence, there is a huge general disorientation, aimlessness, and even helplessness in practice. Actually, there seems to be only one very small common denominator concerning ethics on interculturality from the side of research. Since post-colonialism had brought the risk of even impeding or even terminating the interaction between ethnic groups. Interculturalism is based on reflections by Martha Nussbaum from 1998. Interculturalism argues in favor of intercultural dialogue. So cultural groups should at least stay in touch with each other. And how can that be done? Interculturalism has at least initiated a new search for solution. Many of these drafts for solutions see the main challenge in the dichotomy between action and structure, and they try to invent new ways to overcome this theoretical deadlock. And what we get is a very colorful and wide array of new approaches. So for example, Juliana Ferri has collected some of the newer approaches. Many of them have colorful names, like for example, flux and becoming, space-time, languaging, situatedness, symbolic competence and decentering oneself, or, for example, the concept of dwelling taken from Heidegger. To sum up, research on interculturality turns out to be in a very messy state when it comes to answering questions about ethics. The issue has been identified as more and more pressing in the last couple of years, but there's not a real or rigorous debate neither yet. Maybe a crossing with sustainability discourse can here be of help, I think. But before we try to consider that, let us have just a short look on what sustainability discourse is really actually about. I start with one of the most prominent and well-known definitions from 1987 from the Brundtland Report. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It contains within it two key concepts. The concept of needs, in particular, the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organizations on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. This definition very often is again split down further into different areas of action. So the most prominent model is the so-called three-pillar model of sustainability, splitting it into environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. The development of what we understand as sustainability or sustainable development today, from the present perspective, is very often put into a narration of subsequent historical steps. This narration builds on the assumption that the notion of sustainability has been driven forward by a sequence of political international conferences. It is assumed that these conferences build upon each other, which actually also means that in these meetings always the same persons or at least representatives of the same units have taken part. So that must be a construction. Here I have selected only one such timescale from the website of the United Nations on sustainability. What is very visible here is the fact that it cannot be seen, as I said, as anything else but a retrospectively constructed discourse. So now, if I go through the history, please be assured that I will not go through all these steps. I will not bore you with that. I have chosen a different approach. I was actually interested in retracing the way in which social and maybe even cultural dimensions have entered sustainability discourse that at the beginning had been purely technical and economic as a discourse. Maybe one more aspect and idea which I think is important to notice is if you take sustainability as a discourse, I would raise the question, is there any reflection on if sustainability goals are culture specific or formulated from an ethnocentric viewpoint? And I think no. Like if you compare the discourse, for example, to the discourse of global human rights, where there is a huge debate on whether human rights are culture specific, ethnocentric or not. Actually, I didn't find anything comparable to that in the discourse on sustainability. Here, actually, everything is clear. But if you look at this map, I found that it is on what country actually today best fulfills the sustainabilities in the world. And important to know, the map has been designed by a German foundation, and surprise, surprise, Germany is one of the best performing countries. Maybe because the goals have a European bias, I would say. So let us start with a short chronological overview. To do so, I start in 1972. Here we have started with the so-called Club of Rome, which had published a report on what they called the limits to growth. You may remember this famous and early warning in the spirit of the 1970s. They contrasted the exponential worldwide economic growth versus our limited resources. From this, they followed that we should more carefully spend our resources. If you skip through this report, you will see that it is full of graphics and statistics that are all aimed at supporting the main line of argument. Here you can see, for example, that the world population is increasing more and more, and the growth is particularly visible in the less developed regions where they see for the future an even exponential growth. Or here, for example, in the same way, the amount of money and monetary wealth is increasing exponentially just because of clever investment. So to conclude, culture or social aspects did not play any real role so far. So for the first time, this slightly changed in 1987. When the so-called Brundtland Report was passed. It was published by the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development, and it was titled Our Common Future. The Brundtland Report was named after the then Norwegian Prime Minister who was chairing this commission. Generally, the report was on environmental issues, and it focused on the need of nations to work together. However, there were also first small traces for social and cultural issues here. The Brundtland Report can be read on the internet, and if you full text search the document, you will find some first small traces. Somewhere within its passages, the report acknowledges that it is one of people's basic needs and rights to preserve their cultural identity. Another insight relates to the fact that environmental issues are inseparably tied to political and social issues. So you cannot treat environmental issues without considering society. The report even acknowledges the existence of cultural differences in social and cultural practices. The report acknowledges that social isolation can lead to poor development performances, but their isolation has also meant that few of them have shared in national economic and social development. This may be reflected in their poor health, nutrition, and education. So social contact, international relations, international interaction are the keys to growth and wealth and development. Technical equipment and money do not help and are not sufficient as long as there is no international or intergroup communication and exchange. This contact is supposed to be supported. With gradual advance of organized development into remote regions, these groups are becoming less isolated, so there are mutual and reverse effects. Furthermore, later on, there is a full chapter on peace, security, development, and the environment. Therein, there is a passage on the cost of the arms culture. That may sound weird to us, but at least there is already something like an interpretive perspective on cultural issues at all. And then later on in that chapter, it is about security and sustainable development. Here, they argue for disarmament and security. Both are political and social issues, definitely beyond the previous narrow focus on economics and environment. Another decisive step towards social and cultural issues can be found in 1992, when the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development took place, which was also called the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit from 1992. The results of this conference produced even more precise documents on how to design sustainable development in different sectors of economic and social life. And for this time, this conference introduces the notion of social sustainability. So the third pillar from the pillar model was actually added right here. This conference too has its detailed reports and documentations on the internet. Amongst other documents, the conference here has passed the so-called Agenda 21. And here again, an even closer and more detailed treatment of social and cultural issues can be identified. Under the section on empowering communities, they argue in favor of respecting the cultural integrity and the rights of indigenous people and their communities. This is one very common approach and understanding of culture in the sustainability discourse. It is assumed that people have a right for their cultural identity. This is one main point. Here again, the agenda speaks of sustainable development and the cultural, social, economic, and physical well-being of indigenous people. So it is assumed here that disadvantaged groups in the world are challenged with and have the right to maintain their cultural identity, and they are supposed to be helped in these respects. Let us take another step up 17 years later to the year 2009. What has then been published was the UNESCO World Report 2009, Investing in Cultural Diversity and Cultural Dialogue. Here, even the title already speaks of aspects of culture, and from the introduction onwards, there is a thematization of culture here. So the introduction highlights the importance of investing in cultural diversity as an essential dimension of cultural dialogue. So while in the previous document there was an emphasis on the rights of people for their own cultural identity, here it is an emphasis on diversity and dialogue among different cultures. So another dimension. And as a last step from our youngest past, what I mentioned in the beginning, the United Nations published their Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And here, since then and until today, the UNESCO speaks of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Doing so, they highlight the multitude of very different fields where sustainability can be implemented, where it is needed and necessary. And the image highlights that all these dimensions will necessarily have to be taken care for together to reach an overall sustainable development. So categories cannot be of help if therefore other categories are neglected. If we read deeper into this report to find out what it is emphasizing on, we can see that it pleads for respect for race, ethnicity, and cultural diversity. I think surprisingly, this is a little bit more passive than the previous call for active dialogue. It may be or not until then a kind of post-colonial turn, this is my interpretation, has even reached the UN agenda that lately warning from a too naive and too pushy understanding of dialogue. A few pages further on, the authors repeat and rephrase this orientation. We pledge to foster intercultural understanding, tolerance, mutual respect, and an ethic of global citizenship and shared responsibility. In fact, this is the first moment where intercultural understanding is on the agenda, whereas before, as I said, it has been first the right for identity, then preserving diversity, and latest dialogue. Also in this document, they formulate positive and forward-oriented ideals on how this intercultural understanding should be shaped as a promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Here, actually, again, they turn back to the always prevailing and general idea of sustainability discourse. Culture is something to be sustained for its own goods. Diversity is a value in itself, and that should be sustained, so the whole rhetoric is a bit unclear, or at least it does not fully have one single line of argument. There are different interpretations of the role of culture used here in parallel. So to sum up this short overview on the entering of culture into sustainability discourse, I would conclude that first, intercultural understanding as a goal enters the discourse on sustainability at a very late stage. And at the same time, I think that this is actually somewhat surprising, since normally there's a considerable awareness for the problem of world peace and for the problem that in last decades, many international conflicts have been interpreted from a culturalist perspective, which means that either cultural difference is being made responsible for the conflict, or from a more sophisticated perspective, it is seen that in many international conflicts, culture or religious differences are strategically used as an instrument and as a legitimation for conflict. Since the cultural dimension has entered the discourse that lately, we must also conclude from what we have read in the documents, that notions on what intercultural understanding is supposed to be, what it looks like, and how it should be reached are still largely unclear and undefined on a more specific or precise basis. Seen from the other side, from research on intercultural communication, we get a similar picture. Even if the sustainability of positive intercultural relations may be a desirable goal, research on intercultural communication hardly thematizes that. References to sustainability discourse in intercultural research are mostly very unspecific, and largely the two discourses are not really connected. Here, I think it would just be worth a chance, since, as we have seen before, there is a strong criticism on the aimlessness and the disorientation of intercultural research, and many authors feel the need that something should be done. So since there is only a very vague and even no connection between these discourses, I would like to use the next section of my presentation to explore different ways on how to establish this connection. Although hidden and few, there are already some suggestions in the literature. So to check some evaluations from the side of cultural research, we could conclude for the time being that sustainability discourse is one of the most prominent political platforms on which global change is being discussed in these years. Duxbury and Kangas, two authors from the field of cultural planning, confirm that sustainability is a complex set of visions for the future of humanity. And German linguist Michael Rödel even adds that the semantic invention of the term sustainability has a global historic reach and weight. Sustainability should thus be seen as the first genuine cosmopolitan term of humankind. So I think there are some very great expectations in the air over here. And even more, according to Christian Becker, who wrote even later in a book on sustainability ethics, sustainability has an inherently ethical dimension. It stands for a positive normative orientation on a very general basis. And sustainability ethics are a rather complex issue because they require us to consider humans in their relations to other humans in their society, then future humanity, and third, humans' relation to nature. He says that such an ethics does not really exist yet. However, just the vagueness can also be seen as a chance, and maybe this is even intended. So, for example, Robinson, 2004, for example, follows that the history of the birth of sustainability can be seen as a narration with different facets that are open for interpretation. And he comes to a positive evaluation of this vagueness. He says, he is talking of a constructive ambiguity. So just because the concept of sustainability is so open for interpretation, it is particularly suitable for the pursuit of global goals. They acknowledge that it is very hard or maybe even impossible, but maybe neither necessary, to find and to establish two precise global solutions or orientations. We are living in a very complex and diverse world, and it is thus just natural that there will be no simple solutions, that orientations will again and again have to be negotiated, discussed, compared, and modified by mutual reception and quotation. But of course, such an openness also has its risks and dangers. It is very open to abuse too. So if we come to a critical evaluation of this openness, considering insights from critical discourse research, we should conclude that inconsistencies and ruptures in this narration may point at the fact that discourse on sustainability may also have some hidden dimensions that are not put into words explicitly, which means that, for example, sustaining and confirming existing power imbalances, although verbalizing and claiming the reverse. So sustainability discourse will probably very often argue against power imbalances, but may support them on a subtle basis nevertheless. To sum up again, research on interculturality should better be connected to sustainability discourse, and approaching sustainability discourse would even bring some benefits for research on interculturality. So since intercultural research is accused as lacking of precise goals, sustainability discourse may help specifying these goals or at least encouraging them as a discussion about them. To put that in a short scheme, I have summarized the symbiosis with this graphics here. We have two dimensions or blocks here, one of sustainability discourse and the other one on intercultural research. Sustainability discourse has very strong normative orientations, that is one of its central content and character, but at the same time it is rather void of content. For research on interculturality, it is somewhat a reverse case. Research on interculturality has only a very weak normative orientation, or at least there's only a weak consciousness about normative orientations. However, research on interculturality is full of content. There's a lot of research, many insights into intercultural communication, many theories, models, but there's only a very, very weak normative orientation, or at least there's only a weak consciousness about normative orientations. So I think both fields could complement each other. Sustainability discourse could provide some inspirations on thinking about normative orientations towards intercultural research. And conversely, intercultural research could provide some content insights to sustainability research. So if intercultural understanding would enter sustainability research as an additional dimension, this would be a dimension with a lot of existing research knowledge. Duxbury et al. Summarized three different very general understandings or integrations of culture as a factor into sustainability discourse. The first one is culture in sustainability. This actually means that culture is added as another fourth pillar to the pillar model of sustainability. The second one is culture for sustainability. This means that culture may help to or should be transformed in a way as to help to support the pursuit of the existing sustainability goals, and particularly it should mediate between the other dimensions. A third understanding would be culture as sustainability. Here, culture would be seen as the foundation for sustainable development. Only within an adequate culture, notions of sustainability may grow, it is assumed here. Rittenhofer et al. Point at another risk and danger of sustainability discourse and research. Talking about sustainability may have more divisive effects than reuniting effects. Since sustainability must be a global undertaking, we would need reuniting effects, but talking about sustainability very often automatically implies that there are other people and groups who do not act in a sustainable way, and they will marginalized by this discourse instead of being open for an intergroup discussion and exchange. Though the scheme implies that there will always be an evaluative distinction between sustainable and non-sustainable people. And this distinction can be strategically used as a communicative weapon, because who judges what is sustainable and what not? Another dividing risk, if we acknowledge that there are several different sustainability goals, this notion of different orientations should not be used to play off one dimension against the other one. However, the metaphor of different dimensions or orientations already includes this play-off as a basis. There's quite a number of ideas actually on how to relate the discourses on sustainability and on interculturality to each other yet. This was one first perspective I wanted to present you, and is actually the visionary perspective towards the future. If we want to envision these orientations, we must start at where we are, and this is why, as another step, I would like to assess the contemporary practice and usage of the notion of sustainability in intercultural research. I made a literature review on the use of the words sustainable and sustainability in research literature on intercultural communication. So for this, I just took a number of academic journals who were carrying the word intercultural in their titles, and I used the full text searches on their publishers' websites to identify articles that contained these words. As a time span, I used the full publication period of each journal, so from its first beginning up to the present, which then was 2014. I found in the Journal of Intercultural Communication Research from 2006 onwards, 4 articles. In the International Journal of Intercultural Relations, 15 articles from 1977. In Language and Intercultural Communication, 6 articles from 2001 onwards. In the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, 11 articles from 2008 onwards. Journal of Intercultural Studies, I found 21 articles from 1980 onwards. In the web-based Journal of Intercultural Communication, I found 2 articles from 1999. And in the German-based online journal Intercultural Journal, I found 10 articles from 2014. Well, to the Journal of Intercultural Communication, they only have 2 articles which are found as relevant, but I must say that one is a very important one. So, yeah. So I took this sample of texts as a basis, and I made a critical reading of them with particular consideration of the uses of the word sustainable and sustainability. Particularly, I wanted to find out if there were different usages of these words that may be distinguished into categories. In my reading, I came to the conclusion that there are actually 3 different general usages of the word sustainability and sustainable. I named them as an idiocentric use, a utilitarian use, and an allocentric use. An idiocentric use means that sustainability is called for the sake of ourselves, for the persistence of our own culture. A utilitarian use of the terms meant that the sustainability of any aspect of culture is used and instrumentalized for another aim, but not for any form of cultural persistence or intercultural understanding. Other aims could be economic success, for example. And finally, allocentric uses on the notions of sustainability and sustainable employ the notion with an aim as for the sake of everyone and on the assumption that all cultures are equal. The distinction between idiocentric and allocentric attitudes towards interculturality for the first time, actually, by the way, had been introduced by Harry Triandis in 1985 in a study in a social psychological context. So he used the notions first. So let us have a closer look at the three dimensions of sustainability found in intercultural research. Idiocentric uses of sustainability focus on one single culture or organization. And there are, even in the interculturalist literature, very few pleas for the perspective that sustainability in any of its fields of application is not important. Other goals, like for example economic success, are more important. Then, in the interculturalist literature, there are still many ethnocentric notions of culture, and they do not necessarily value one's own culture higher than other cultures. That would be a bit too blunt, but there are a number of notions that actually still depart from an ethnocentric viewpoint. And then almost automatically you get into the line of argument that your own culture should be taken care for first. These idiocentric notions almost automatically argue for a preservation of cultural diversity and for the persistence of distinct cultures. And although this is meant with good intentions, it actually supports the cultural divide and it cements the status quo. So sustainability may sometimes hinder competing goals. Here I use illustrations from outside my sample, of course, just to exaggerate and to highlight what I mean. And we can see that actually these positions definitely do exist in society. And the idiocentric use of sustainability is even present in the official United Nations documents on sustainable development. So let us remember the claims on the preservation of cultural identities and cultural diversity. Actually, this is a dividing orientation. Let us go to the second dimension, utilitarian understandings of sustainability. Here it is argued that a sustainable care for intercultural relations may serve other sustainability goals. Here in the picture, for example, economic goals. So intercultural sustainability is seen as a tool for economic growth and technological development. In the literature, this manifests, for example, when thematizing intercultural training, not always, but sometimes, intercultural training then is used to make the effects of a company's staff more sustainable, which means actually they should just work better and more efficiently. So let us come to the third and last category, allocentric uses of the notion of intercultural sustainability. Allocentric uses refers to understanding of intercultural understanding at eye level. From this perspective, all cultures should be seen as equal and as equally valuable. Still, too, it may promote a sustainable cultural diversity, also appreciating each other's identities. And one of its main aims is a sustainable, peaceful living together across cultures. It promotes intercultural understanding at eye level. Right here, you may notice that I have not chosen these categories without a moral judgment. The first two categories, idiocentric and utilitarian, are bad, and the allocentric uses are the good ones. I should not deny this, and so my view on the literature, of course, was not without moral judgment. Because I think that this category of allocentric uses is actually the only option of future sustainability, and the other categories should actually be taken care of. I took a more detailed look into this category. I checked where allocentric uses of the notion of intercultural sustainability even today are used most frequently. And in the literature, I came to the results that actually those are the fields where in intercultural research, allocentric uses are more frequently used than in others. First, when it is about the plurality of Englishes, or maybe even against the hegemony of English all over the world and the preservation of native languages or local languages. Then the field in student exchange research and also internationalization at home. They also use allocentric notions of intercultural sustainability, intercultural training too. Very many intercultural trainings are about fostering sustainable intercultural relations. Then the large field of cultural planning for communities. the field of politics and international conflict management. They use allocentric uses of sustainability, and then the large field of development aid. If development aid is thematized in intercultural research, it is almost always connected to ideas of seeing intercultural understanding as a tool for or as a part of development aid, and there they use this form of sustainability as an understanding. Okay, so I here have come to this little research section, and it is time for some methodological critique. Some few points in these veins. First, of course, as I have said, the study is a little old, but I think it is still relevant and adequate, as I have argued. And then, of course, the approach was not very systematic. Maybe I could add that here. The study is from 2014. And really, I thought of doing the study again just for this conference. And I went through the literature again. I did some research, and I thought I have to rework all this. Finally, I didn't really do it because the result were disappointing. There's not really much progress on notions of sustainability in intercultural research. If you make a bibliometric survey, you can see that the word intercultural sustainability is exponentially increasing, even in the last 4 or 5 years, but never related to intercultural communication. So there's rather a deadlock, and we still stick to these categories that I have presented. So I think they are still up to date. And they can be taken as a basis. So looking at my sample from a methodological perspective, see its limitations, it is a very positivist way and approach in which I have gathered my sample. So I just gathered the terms from the databases. And another point for criticism is that I have not used a precise method to come to my results. So it is just interpretation how I came to these categories. Still, I think it may be of help getting valuable insights, particularly when it comes to ethics and interculturality, which was my starting point. Yeah, from a methodological perspective, however, there may be even more pressing questions. My main argument was in favor of bringing together two disciplines, two discourses, two research fields, sustainability and interculturality. And from an academic perspective, one may ask why. There's no academic reason to do that. And even if we are ready to allow for this merger of approaches, is it really possible from the perspective of scientific theorizing? Can we simply transfer theories and models between two completely different disciplines? There are several different answers to this doubtful question, and one is, yes, these answers are happening all the time. Actually, this is the only way in which science can work at all. But there are also arguments against the transfer. So we maybe better not make these transfers because complexity on the research objects and of the theories may be lost. We are going to be victims of reductionism. This is the great danger. And that will in the end lead us to results that are inadequate and no longer relevant. And then another argument against the transfers of theories may be that these mergers will weaken each of the single disciplines and paradigms. So even if a merger was intended to produce more political attention, which is also the case for intercultural sustainability, of course, the effects may be the contrary. Anyway, although there are strong criticisms, I would say we can stick to the first green one, and we should be courageous and try and experiment with that merger. Okay, so I have come actually to the last section of my presentation, what remains to be done. To summarize, I would say allocentric uses of the concept of sustainability are the only ones that support the notion of intercultural understanding as an additional pillar for a global discourse on general sustainability. Not all mentions of the term sustainability in intercultural research use the term in an allocentric understanding of the concept, and not all research in intercultural communication automatically contributes to the general aims of global sustainability. So I would conclude there should be a better consciousness in intercultural research for if and how to contribute to general sustainability, or more precisely, how to use the attributes sustainable and sustainability in a responsible way. There are also some risks and challenges from this. They still remain. Intercultural research actually will be the same. So even allocentric uses of the notion of sustainability run the risk of essentializing culture and of conceiving global understanding from an ethnocentric viewpoint. So this is the old thing still remaining. And essentialist notions of culture will always reconfirm the final incommensurability of cultures. So they will just impede global sustainability goals. Okay, so now I have come to the end of my presentation. I had started with the problems of developing an ethical perspective on interculturality and intercultural research. I suggested that considering sustainability discourse could be a good starting point and have an initiation of such a reflection. I have reported on sustainability discourse, and I have presented some models on how to combine them. Then I took a look at contemporary uses of the notion of sustainability, singling out allocentric notions of this use, showed that not all notions of sustainability and interculturality may also serve desirable ethical goals, and that thus a cautious usage of the notion will be needed. Still, I think that the sustainability of intercultural relations is a notion that it's worth thinking about. Okay, so that was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening through this very, very long speech. It must be a long stretch of talk for you looking the video. So thank you very much for your patience. And maybe you have some ideas or questions, and I will be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dominic. We have good 15 minutes of questions, so I'm going to run around with a microphone, and maybe if there will be, more mics needed, we have 2 more, so prepare your questions.
Thanks, Dominic. I have to tell you that thanks to you, I feel less marginalized. I first got interested in the connection between sustainability and intercultural communication back in 2001. But guess what? In 2005, at my presentation at Saint-Paul-de-Vence at CETAR Congress, actually, I had much smaller audience than you do today. And also, I never realized that there were so many people who did research on the connection between sustainability and intercultural communication. Because whenever I raised up this issue at sustainable development conferences or meetings, people would not really buy into it. A little notice here was that you said that you don't think that sustainability is culture connected. Thank you for very deep research into the theory. I went much less deep than that, much more to the grassroots level. However, even when you look at at least 3 definitions of sustainability, you mentioned the Brundtland, which is very action-oriented. If you go to what Gandhi said, Indira Gandhi, she said she connected sustainability and fighting poverty. And then the Rio de Janeiro definition is harmony. It stressed harmony. So 3 definitions, 3 cultures of 3 different people, of 3 different places. Already we hear different cultures in the definitions. Also, there is an interesting issue in the UNESCO report that you were mentioning. And that is that particular report stressed the necessity to apply the knowledge of indigenous people. However, I don't know about us here, interculturalists, however, the sustainability people, when they speak, for instance, in one conference there was an Australian who said that, yeah, we have to take care of the cultural minorities in Australia. At that point I said, guys, the so-called cultural minority, that is indigenous people, have been happily living for thousands of years in Australia without ruining anything. And here comes the minority, the white people, and start ruining things. At that point, he said that he had to think about it. Well, thank you again very much. The remarks were just to show you that I'm really grateful, not feeling that lonely anymore. And guess what? There are publications in Russian about that.
Please email.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Here?
Could I say something just right? Thank you very much for that contribution. I just want to add one aspect what drives me around on sustainability research. I would agree that the topic intercultural sustainability does not get very much attention in research, and it is actually hard to publish on that. And I think one main problem or reason for that is that it is not really pure research. To be honest, talking about intercultural sustainability is a political discourse, and if we try to find ways to define intercultural sustainability, it is a political undertaking. We want to get more attention for our cause, for intercultural understanding, and joining the sustainability discourse might be a good way to do that. So there are many fields, other disciplines all over the world. They all want to change the sustainability goals, and it is more or less a competition to get in. So if we are in this field 4.7 and the sustainability goals, I would say we are still marginalized. It is not really in. And this is a political discourse. And the other side would be do research about that. How can you do research about a thing where you actually already have your goal beforehand? So this is no longer research in its pure sense. So what I did with my study on the use of intercultural or the terms of sustainability in these journals is actually the attempt to do a kind of empirical research just to show the state of the art and use empirical research to point at things that are maybe not really precisely expressed or could be more specified, and using that kind of research to, of course, on a subtle basis, to push into political directions too. So the gap between policymaking and research is still existing, and that may be the problem why it doesn't really get much attention in the research sector. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Jens had another question, right?
Yeah. Hello, Dominic. Thank you for
Hello.
a very good overview of I guess, the new emerging field, sustainability and intercultural relations. Thank you also for making your talk, for me personally, thrilling. I was waiting for my journal to come up, and it came up last. And I had no idea whether we had anything on sustainability or not, but you saved my face, so to speak.
Jonas, yeah, 2006.
2006? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So that was interesting and thrilling. I have two questions that I want to ask you. The first, I want to make a politically incorrect defense of essentialism. Okay, I think that what we're doing in most sciences is looking for the essence of things. That's also true in this one. And if we look at the essence of something I've been dealing with a lot, language, of course it's part of its essence to change and to have influence from other languages. You cannot really have a real understanding of language unless you see that it's changing all the time and that there is influence from other languages. Exactly the same with culture. How can we study culture without recognizing that there is a lot of change all the time and that it's influenced by other cultures? I just don't see this politically correct anti-essentialism. That's my first point. Do you want to answer that, and then I do my second point?
I don't need to defend that. I agree with you too.
You agree? Okay, good. Okay. So my second point is with the term sustainability. Actually, for a long time, I've had difficulties with this term. And my first difficulty was, when they started to talk about economic sustainability. And I thought, fairly quickly, I thought, you know, something can be economically sustainable, but completely environmentally unsustainable. You know, you have to go for profit, you have to have the right levels of income, etc., etc. That might have severe consequences for nature. More generally, I think that short-term sustainability often comes into conflict with long-term sustainability. I think there's a kind of inherent contradiction in this concept, and maybe it'll be interesting to see or hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, many authors agree with that. They say it is a paradox. It cannot be reached. It is an utopia, and we cannot take it as an ideal where we strive for. Of course, in contrast to, or compared to that, these sustainability goals from 2015, where UNESCO tries to measure success factors, this is an absurd undertaking, and the absurdness becomes visible if you see how general the results are. So it is ridiculous, actually. So I agree with you. But I would say that, on the other hand, this is a chance for the sustainability discourse that it is open. It will definitely not come to a clear conclusion. And so maybe it may be the same case with world dialogue on peace and intercultural understanding. It has to be, and has to remain a permanent dialogue. We will not come to a result. We have to stay in dialogue and stay in touch, and that's why I think the sustainability metaphor is a good metaphor, just expressing that and encouraging us to stay in dialogue and in a permanent discussion. And there will be no nation having the right all over the world sustainability goals for all of us, but it cannot be negotiated and dealt out by a permanent discussion. And that could be a fruitful way, I think. Of course, it is a vision again, but still. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. There's another question in the back, please.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Ines and I'm representing civil society sector in this conference. And actually I was amazed listening that you are looking for the answers. We are looking in the civil society sector now, but just maybe in different words and different forms. So I would say that actually my compliments to you that you found culture in 4.7, because civil society now in all over the world are criticizing global goals because they lack cultural dimension, and they are nationalized, but they are nationalized politically, not culturally. So I really encourage you to continue this work, and we will be looking forward for other researchers and their work, and will promote definitely in our work with government and civil society sector, and we will definitely also use this lecture in our national level work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that, and as I've said, I would have loved to join your conference, and I would have hoped to find also new partners for this research. So if you are interested, if you have good ideas, please stay in touch with me, and maybe we can initiate some future projects, really.
Is it working? Yeah. So we have room for one more question, or maybe two, if anyone is willing to volunteer. If not, then really great thank you for your ability to join us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I wish you a very good and successful conference. That will be an inspiring atmosphere. I can see that. Thank you very much for listening. It was great. Technique worked perfectly. It was perfect acoustics for me, at least. I hope it was okay for you as well. So thank you very much to the technicians also. Great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice conference.
Okay, so we continue with little practical information. So shortly we